Elizabeth Taylor, a name tied to some of the loudest things Hollywood has ever produced. 7 marriages, diamonds worth millions of dollars, romances that made the world pause to watch. A life constantly under scrutiny, constantly talked about, always at the center of scandals big and small. People remember her as a symbol of beauty, of passion, and of choices that stirred controversy. But there is a truth almost forgotten. Amid all that chaos, Elizabeth Taylor raised 4 children, and none of them collapsed. None were consumed by the spotlight. None disappeared beneath the overwhelming shadow of their mother. How could a woman who lived her entire life in the whirlwind of media attention, loss, divorce, illness, and personal crises manage to keep a family from falling apart? How could a life always on the brink of breaking become a place strong enough for children to grow without shattering? Elizabeth Taylor was not a perfect woman. She made mistakes, choices that came with consequences she herself had to bear. But if you look at her 4 children, the way they grew up, the way they live, and the way they still hold on to one another, perhaps the most remarkable thing is not her career or her fame. It is something simpler, harder, and far rarer. She truly fulfilled her role as a mother. To understand why that was so difficult, almost impossible, you have to go back to the beginning. Before Elizabeth Taylor became a mother, she was already a phenomenon the world could not look away from. Elizabeth Taylor was born in 1932 in London into an American family. War forced her family to move to Los Angeles, and almost immediately, Hollywood recognized what the world would later see: a beauty impossible to ignore, and a face that could hold its own before the camera from a very young age. She signed with MGM as a child, and just a few years later had become one of the most prominent child stars of her time. But what stands out is not that she became famous, it is the speed of it. There was no transition, no quiet space to grow up. Elizabeth Taylor's youth unfolded on film sets, under bright lights, and under the constant gaze of the public. By the early 1950s, as she entered her 20s, she was no longer a promising star. She was a true icon. Her flourishing career was matched by a personal life that began to follow the same rhythm. In 1952, she married Michael Wilding, an English actor much older than her, a relationship Elizabeth later admitted was more about seeking stability than love. A year later, in 1953, she gave birth to her first child. And that is where 2 lives collided. On one side was a superstar at her peak, living within a relentless filming schedule, surrounded by media and the pressures of Hollywood. On the other side was a newborn child, needing stability, needing a home, needing a mother who was present. Elizabeth Taylor's children were not born into an ordinary family. They were born into the spotlight. Their childhood was not tied to a fixed place, but to constant movement between Los Angeles, Europe, and Switzerland. Schools changed, cities changed, and with each marriage, the image of a father within the family changed as well. This is the kind of environment in which many families cannot hold their original shape. Fame, if large enough, can distort everything, even the closest relationships. But what matters is not the chaos itself. It is how Elizabeth Taylor faced it. She did not turn her children into part of the stage. She did not pull them in front of the camera to reinforce her public image. When the door closed, she tried to preserve something very different, a space untouched by the media. Holidays were not meant to be seen, but to be remembered. Birthdays were not events, but memories. And in a life that had almost no privacy, she still tried to give her children moments that the spotlight could not reach. In a life that was always in motion, yes, Elizabeth Taylor still tried to create something that seemed simple, a sense of family. And from that fragile foundation, the story of her 4 children began. Elizabeth Taylor had 4 children, each carrying a very different story. But if there is a place where tragedy touched this family earliest, it is the story of Liza Todd. Liza was the daughter of Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd, the man many believed was the greatest love of her life. Not because he was perfect, but because during the short time they were together, Elizabeth's life, for the first time, found a different rhythm, less chaotic, less driven by constant pursuit. It felt as if a real family was beginning to take shape, rather than just two people standing side by side under the spotlight. But that feeling did not last. In March 1958, Mike Todd boarded his private plane named Lucky Liz, flying from California to New York. Elizabeth had wanted to be on that flight. He refused, for a very simple reason. She had a cold and needed to stay behind and rest. That small detail later became the line between life and death. The plane crashed in bad weather. There were no survivors, no goodbye, no time to prepare for an ending. At the age of 26, Elizabeth Taylor did not only lose the husband she loved most at that time, she lost a rare chance at stability, something she had almost never had before. Those who were with her at the time recalled that the shock came so suddenly, so decisively, that she could barely react. For a long time, the only way she managed to keep going was to return to work, as if leaving herself no space to completely fall apart. And Liza, she grew up within an absence she had no memory to name. She did not remember her father. There was no real image for her to hold on to. Everything she knew about Mike Todd came from the stories of others, from her mother, from family members, from the photographs that were kept. It was not a loss in the sense of having and then losing, but an absence from the very beginning, quiet yet persistent. That is the kind of beginning many children carry with them for a lifetime, but what matters is not the loss itself, but what came after. Elizabeth Taylor could have let this shock pull everything down, her family, her children, herself. But she did not. Her life remained turbulent, new relationships appeared, controversies continued to surround her, yet through all of it, she did not let go of her role as a mother. Richard Burton entered Elizabeth's life in a relationship that sparked intense controversy, followed and judged by the media at every turn. But behind what the public saw, he gradually became a stabilizing presence within the family. In 1964, Burton formally adopted Liza, not as a mere legal obligation, but as a commitment to belong. He could not replace Mike Todd. No one could. But his presence was enough to keep the absence from turning into a fracture that would break everything apart. Liza grew up in an environment where she could have stepped into Hollywood if she had wanted to. She had every condition to become part of the world that built her mother's fame. But she did not choose that path. She chose sculpture, a field almost opposite to the spotlight, working with metal with heavy and still forms, with things that do not need to be seen to exist. Her life unfolded far from Hollywood, far from the noise that once surrounded her childhood. That was not avoidance. It was a conscious choice, a way to build her own identity without having to fight against the overwhelming shadow behind her. Many years later, Liza's son became involved in the work of the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, continuing a part of the legacy Elizabeth left behind. Quietly, without display, but enough to show that what Elizabeth preserved within her family did not end with one generation. Liza grew up without her father beside her. But she did not grow up in collapse. And if you look at her life, one thing becomes very clear. Elizabeth Taylor could not control what happened to her own life, but she tried to control something far more important, not letting those losses completely define her children's lives. Liza's story makes one thing very clear. A child can begin with loss, but does not necessarily have to end in collapse. But not every challenge in Elizabeth Taylor's family came from sudden tragedies like that. Some were quieter, longer lasting, and harder to recognize. Pains that did not come from a single moment, but formed over time. The story of her first child, Michael Wilding Jr., began with that kind of instability. Michael was the first child Elizabeth Taylor held in her arms. Born in 1953 during her marriage to Michael Wilding, an English actor much older than her. At that time, the marriage gave Elizabeth something she had been searching for: a sense of calm, maturity, and a certain safety amid an overwhelmingly noisy Hollywood. But that balance did not truly last. As Elizabeth became more famous and more confident, the distance between them began to show clearly. Long trips, back-to-back films, and the constant attention of the public gradually created a gap neither of them could close. From the beginning, that marriage had not been built on the same rhythm. By the time Michael was still very young, the family had already begun to fracture. Not long after, the marriage ended. Michael grew up in an environment where stability was always temporary. Like his siblings, his childhood was tied to constant movement, changing schools, and adapting to new father figures each time his mother's life entered another chapter. But there was one difference. Elizabeth did not force Michael to become part of the world that had made her. She gave him the chance to try, and also the freedom to walk away. Michael stepped into acting, appearing in several television and film projects. It was not a failure, but it was not a path where he truly belonged. And what is notable is that he was not kept there simply because of the name Elizabeth Taylor. He stepped away, quietly, without declaration, without once trying to prove anything to the public. Michael turned to sculpture, a choice somewhat similar to Liza's, but reached by a different path. From the spotlight, he moved toward quieter spaces, where work did not depend on the attention of others. His life gradually settled in Santa Fe, far from Hollywood, far from what had once been the center of his childhood. That is not a story of failure. It is a story of stepping away from a path before it becomes a burden. Not every child who grows up in the spotlight needs to remain in it. And what matters most here is not Michael's choice, but the way Elizabeth Taylor accepted that choice. She did not force her children to continue a legacy. She gave them the right not to be like her. Michael stepped away from the spotlight in a very quiet way. No collisions, no collapse, no single event large enough to push his life off course. He simply tried, realized it was not where he belonged, and walked away before it became a burden. Not every child in Elizabeth Taylor's family had such a gentle exit. Some stories do not begin with a choice, but with an event no one involved can control. Christopher Wilding was such a case. Christopher grew up in the same environment, constant movement, living through the shifts in his mother's life and learning to exist in a family where the idea of stability was always temporary. But unlike his brother, he did not seek a place in front of the spotlight. He chose to stay behind it, working in sound, where the work is judged by precision, not attention. His life, at least for a time, he seemed to follow a normal course, until he married Aileen Getty. Aileen came from a family whose name alone carried power, the Gettys, one of the wealthiest families in America, but also one of the most troubled. Wealth did not spare them from tragedy. It only made those tragedies more public. In the early years, Christopher and Aileen's marriage remained relatively private. They had children, built a life of their own, and did not stand at the center of media attention as Elizabeth once had. Then, in 1985, everything changed in a way no one could have prepared for. Aileen Getty was diagnosed with HIV. At that time, AIDS was not just an illness. It was a social fear. People did not yet understand how it spread, but they responded with near total rejection. Those who were infected did not only face the risk of death, they were also pushed out of communities, out of families, out of relationships that had once existed. This news did not only affect Aileen's health, it shook the entire marriage. At first, Aileen told Christopher that she had contracted HIV through a blood transfusion. But later, the truth came out. It was the result of an extramarital affair. And it was that detail that made everything impossible to repair. Christopher filed for divorce. Custody of the children was granted to him. The marriage ended in a cold, definitive way, leaving little room for reconciliation. At that point, the story could have followed a familiar script. A woman falls ill, carries the weight of her mistake, is pushed out of her former family's life, and gradually disappears. But Elizabeth Taylor did not allow that to happen. She did not choose the easier side. At a time when society was still debating whether it was safe to even touch someone with HIV, Elizabeth Taylor stood beside Aileen Getty without hiding, without keeping her distance, and without changing the way she treated her. Aileen still called her Mom, not out of politeness, but because that bond had never been severed. This was no longer the story of a marriage that had ended. It was the story of a woman who refused to let illness and another person's mistakes become a reason to turn away. And from this point, an important part of Elizabeth Taylor's life began to change. AIDS was no longer a distant issue to speak about. It became something that had entered her family, something she saw with her own eyes, not through the press, not through statistics, but through a specific person. Elizabeth began to involve herself deeply in HIV/AIDS-related efforts, not just by appearing, not just by speaking, but by directly advocating, fundraising, and confronting the stigma that society at the time was not ready to overcome. She did not stand there as a symbol. She stood there as a mother, someone who chose not to abandon anyone, even when that person was no longer officially part of the family. Christopher lost a marriage. Aileen Getty lost far more than that. But throughout the entire story, one thing did not change. Elizabeth Taylor was not only the mother of the children she gave birth to. She was a mother to those whom life had pushed aside, but whom she still chose to hold on to. Christopher's story shows that Elizabeth Taylor would not turn away, even when everything had gone beyond the boundaries of a marriage. But there is another story where her choice did not begin with obligation, did not begin with ties, but began with a very simple decision: to keep a child she had no obligation to at all. That is Maria Burton. Maria Helene Elisabeth Burton was born in 1961 in Munich, Germany, a beginning that offered few choices from the start. Her biological mother struggled with mental health issues. The family lacked the means to care for her, and more importantly, she was born with a congenital hip condition, one that could have prevented her from ever walking normally without complex medical intervention. At around 3 years old, Maria was adopted by Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. This was not a convenient decision. It was a decision that came with long-term responsibility, medical care, time, and a level of patience not everyone is willing to accept. Elizabeth did not ask whether this child fit into her life. She looked at the opposite, what this child needed and whether anyone would step in. And she stepped in. Maria's childhood was unlike that of any other child in the family. It was not just about moving between countries, not just about growing up between two of Hollywood's biggest stars. It was hospitals. It was a series of surgeries. It was recovery periods where every step forward was uncertain. More than 20 operations. Not a number meant to impress, but a way her childhood was divided into each surgery, each pain, each moment of having to begin again. Throughout that journey, Elizabeth Taylor did not stand at a distance. She was there, not as a star who could arrange everything from afar, but as a mother who followed every operation, every stage of recovery, every moment her child had to relearn what others take for granted. Those moments never appeared in the press, but they are the clearest definition of who she was. Maria grew up in an environment where she could have stepped into the spotlight if she wanted to. She was educated in elite institutions such as La Rosey in Switzerland, and later continued at Stanford, a path many would have used to enter public life. But she did not choose that. She moved into the field of fashion, became involved in charitable work, especially programs related to mental health and child welfare. And like Elizabeth's other children, she maintained a connection with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, not through appearances, but through real work. Her life unfolded away from the spotlight, not because she lacked the opportunity, but because she did not need it. Yet Maria's life, like what has unfolded within this family, has not always been stable. 2 marriages, 2 breakdowns. And at a point when everything began to fall apart again, Maria returned. Not to the image of Elizabeth Taylor the world knew, but to the mother who had chosen her from the very beginning. Elizabeth did not explain. She did not respond to the media. She did not try to control the narrative. She did only one thing: stand by her daughter, unconditionally, without hesitation. If there is a place where Elizabeth Taylor's role as a mother becomes most clear, it is not in the beautiful moments. It is here. A child she did not give birth to, but chose. A childhood shaped by more than 20 surgeries. A life that, even in adulthood, could not avoid its own breakdowns. And a mother who never walked away. Because being a mother in the end is not about when everything is going well. It is about when a child returns in pieces and someone is still there. 4 stories. 4 very different starting points. One grew up without any memory of a father. One chose to step away from the spotlight before it became a burden. One went through a marriage shaped by the greatest fear of its time. And one began life with a series of surgeries whose outcomes no one could guarantee. If each story is viewed on its own, none of them is truly easy. And if placed in the right context, the children of one of the most famous women in the world, the outcome should have been different. At the very least, one of them could have collapsed. At the very least, one could have been consumed by the very name they carried from birth. But that did not happen. None of them were completely destroyed. None were swallowed by Elizabeth Taylor's fame. And that raises another question, one more important than what happened. Not what they went through, but what they were able to hold on to that allowed them to go through all of it without losing themselves. The answer does not lie in what they did when they were young. It lies in how they lived afterward. Liza Todd stepped away from Hollywood very early, living a life almost entirely separate from the spotlight, pursuing sculpture and maintaining a steady rhythm, one not dependent on her mother's name. Michael Wilding Jr. followed a similar path. After a period of trying acting, he left the entertainment industry, moved into visual art, and settled in Santa Fe, far from the center of media attention. Christopher Wilding continued working in production and sound, staying behind the spotlight while maintaining strong ties to his family and to activities connected to Elizabeth Taylor's legacy. Maria Burton, after all the surgeries and personal upheavals, built her own life in fashion and philanthropy while maintaining her connection to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, not through appearances, but through real work. None of them became another version of Elizabeth Taylor, and none of them needed to. If you look at them now, what emerges is not fame, but stability. A kind of stability that is quiet, that does not need to be seen, and yet strong enough to endure over many years, something that, on the surface, Elizabeth Taylor's own life never seemed to have. Elizabeth Taylor was not just a mother. She was one of those rare names that, simply by appearing, could command the attention of an entire era. From a very young age, she was not merely an actress, she was a phenomenon. The films she starred in were not only successful, they helped shape the image of Hollywood for decades. Her 2 Academy Awards were not the peak of her career, but only a part of a long journey in which the name Elizabeth Taylor almost never disappeared from public view. But if it stopped at cinema, her story would still be incomplete. Elizabeth Taylor understood her own value very clearly, and she knew how to turn it into power. She did not only earn from acting roles, but also built sources of income beyond the screen at a time when very few female stars were doing so. Her line of perfumes, especially white diamonds, was not just a product, it became one of the most successful brands in the industry's history, generating hundreds of millions of dollars over many years. At the same time, there were the diamonds, not only for their value, but for the way they were tied to her name. They did not simply sit in jewelry boxes. They carried stories, history, identities of their own, just like the woman who owned them. The press did not only write about her life, but also about what she wore, what she chose, and what she represented. Elizabeth's personal life was never outside the spotlight. 7 marriages, relationships that began under bright lights and ended amid dense headlines. Every decision was analyzed. Every choice was judged. There were no quiet moments, no true sense of privacy. By the end of her life, her fortune was estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, a figure that reflected not only her fame, but also her ability to control the game in an industry where many others were swept along. This is the kind of life people often imagine in a very familiar way. Children growing up in privilege, in excess, under a shadow too large to stand on their own. Or worse, losing themselves before they even have the chance to understand who they are. And that is why what happened within Elizabeth Taylor's family becomes something different. But Elizabeth Taylor's family did not follow that path. None of them became the next version of her. None tried to step into the spotlight to hold on to that radiance, and none were crushed by the very name they were born with. They chose their own paths. Some pursued art, some worked behind the scenes, some almost disappeared from public view. Most of them lived quietly, steadily, a kind of stability that is not loud, but unmistakable. And if you look more closely, there is something even more striking than all of that. The way they remember their mother, not through what the world remembers, not through fame, money, or the stories the press once told, but through things far smaller. Laughter inside the house, holidays prepared with care, the feeling of always having a place to return to, even when everything outside was not steady. But those things do not exist within any fortune, but they are what lasts the longest. Elizabeth Taylor's later years were no longer tied to filming schedules or major projects. The focus shifted entirely to her health and the activities she had maintained for many years before. She went through multiple hospitalizations, surgeries related to her back and hips, along with ongoing respiratory issues. From the late 1990s into the 2000s, her public appearances declined noticeably, and most of her time was spent in private, with continuous medical support. Even so, the family did not drift apart. Her 4 children maintained a steady presence in her life, quietly, without display, but enough to sustain a continuous connection. There were no prolonged fractures, no distances stretched over time, something not easily achieved in families that had gone through so many upheavals. When Elizabeth Taylor passed away in 2011, and her estate was estimated at around $600 million, a figure reflecting decades at the peak of Hollywood, historic contracts, the White Diamonds perfume line, and a diamond collection that had become iconic. Her jewelry, when auctioned, brought in over $100 million, not only for its material value, but because each piece was tied to a story once followed by the entire world. But what stands out is not the scale of that fortune, but the way it did not shape the lives of those who remained. None of her children stepped into the role of image inheritor. None used fame as a foundation to maintain a public presence. They kept their distance from the spotlight in a very natural way, not because they lacked opportunity, but because they did not need it. Part of her legacy continued through the work Elizabeth Taylor had built, especially the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, where the next generations became involved in very different ways, some in front, some behind the scenes, some almost invisible. The rest remained within the family, not in forms that could be seen, but in the way each person chose to live their life. In a life where everything had once been magnified, from love and scandal to wealth, what remained in the end was not in the numbers. It lay in the fact that none of them needed to rely on all of that to know who they were, and could still step out from the largest shadow in Hollywood without collapsing. Elizabeth Taylor is one of those names almost everyone knows, a life tied to the spotlight, to wealth, to relationships that made the entire world watch. But if you set all of that aside and look only at what remains, the story becomes very different. Her 4 children did not grow up in an ordinary life. They went through loss, through breakage, through periods that could have torn apart any other family. None of them were perfect. None had an easy journey. None became another version of Elizabeth Taylor. And none of them needed to. They chose different paths, different rhythms of life, different ways of existing that did not depend on the spotlight that once surrounded their entire family. Each chose their own way. Some stayed close to the arts, some stepped away completely, some almost disappeared from public view. But they all share one thing: they are still standing in their own way. And perhaps that did not come from fame, not from money, but from something much simpler, a place they could always return to, no matter how far their lives had taken them. Elizabeth Taylor may not have held on to everything in her life, but she held on to what mattered most: a family, not lost. I hope her children will always have smooth, fulfilling, and happy lives. What has always impressed you most about Elizabeth Taylor? Is it her captivating beauty, her unforgettable performances, her immense wealth, or the painful tragedies and turmoil she endured throughout her life? What do you think? If you had to choose one thing to represent an entire life, would it be what people see, or what remains when no one is looking anymore? Perhaps each of us will feel differently after hearing this story. But it is precisely those different reflections that keep the story of Elizabeth Taylor and her family worth telling, even many years after she has left this world. I hope this video has brought you useful information. Thank you for watching, and see you again in the next videos.